Good morning to all. Bienvenidos. We have the unenviable task of sort of setting the tone for the discussions that we will have here for the next day and a half. We can cherry pick a lot of the issues that you will be discussing, but we won't be able to take more than a nibble on the cherry because the idea is to talk about some of the panels that will later follow. But the idea is that we can have a very good conversation on several of the issues that you will be discussing. I'm not going to present our panelists. You have their bios in your packages. Suffice it to say that this is a great honor to be with colleagues and friends whom I've worked with for a long time at such an important moment, not only for US-Mexico ties, as Rafael said. These twin elections that take place every 12 years open huge challenges, but also important opportunities. But we're also in a world that is in flux, where geopolitical volatility is starting to impact the Americas, where we're starting to see dynamics of extra-hemispheric powers playing in the American landscape, in the Americas landscape. And at the same time, if you look at the world and you look at, I was watching some of the deliberations at the annual Munich Security Conference. And it seems that Latin America has fallen off the map. Latin America is nowhere to be seen. There's no debate as to what the role of Latin America is. In part, I think this is self-inflicted. If you look at the foreign policies of the majority of Latin American countries in the region today, we seem to be navel-gazing. I've always said that Latin America has tended to punch below its weight in the international arena. Now we're not even getting up on the ring to box. And for countries like most of those in the Americas, with the exception of the US and maybe Canada, I've always said that there are only two ways to go around the world. You either sit at the table or you're on the menu. And there's an increasing danger that Latin America can become part of the menu if it doesn't get its act together. There are truly some domestic forces at play that have made a lot of these countries more inward-looking than we would like. But at the same time, you look at the opportunities, and we discussed this in the conversation that we had before our panel, whether it's on food security or critical minerals or energy resilience, sustainability, efficiency, independence, security, whether it's with the significant impact that Latin America has on biodiversity, megadiversity, and climate change. All of these issues could clearly provide the Latin American countries and the inter-American system with some very important tools to play in the international arena. So we're going to try and obviously, at the end, we're going to try and have here a go at, what would a Trump or a Biden administration imply for inter-American relations, and how does North America fit into this global edifice. But Eli, can I start with you, given that you've been focusing a lot on I sometimes tell my students that if you look at the international system of 2024, it's sort of almost reminiscent of what we saw in 1914 in the international system before the First World War, of fluidity, of challenger powers. How do you see all of this playing? How do you see the position? By the way, I'm sure you know this, there's a report coming out by the RAND Corporation tomorrow it's a commission report by the Department of Defense. David Ignatius apparently had a scoop on the report. It's a pretty damning report about US bandwidth in the international system and the commitment that the US needs to put on the table to be able to reverse some of this geopolitical decline. But how do you see the global context playing into many of the issues, either geopolitical or thematic, that we're going to be discussing these days?
Thank you. Yes, so I think as Rafael pointed out, we're looking at an increasingly volatile and increasingly multipolar world in which the United States and American allies don't have the ability, or have a less of ability than we used to control the trends. And of course, this will differ based on how the Europeans feel, based on the elections in Europe and elections here in the United States. But let me just list seven worrying trends that that I think will have everyone's attention without particular focus on Latin America quite yet. Number one would be climate and the shift away from fossil fuels, which is our responsibility to our children and grandchildren, and more for a Biden administration than for a Trump administration, of course. Number two would be the conflict competition with China over Taiwan and everything else, and which goes with number three, the conflict with Russia over Ukraine and lots of other things, including election interference and all kinds of gray zone conflict. I think if a moment on what that means for Latin America is there's going to be something we saw during the pandemic and we're seeing increasingly is this idea of secure supply chains among friends. And there's that pressure that will come more and more, I believe, to pick sides in who you trade with so that supply chains are secured in the event that the sanction regime gets worse on China, Russia, and the allies, and the alliances. I think a fourth thing that I'd point out is that even though we've shifted in the study of security and attention to security to the great power conflicts, the festering conflicts that generated the terrorism haven't gone away, as we're all quite aware now. And so, Syria and Myanmar and Yemen and Ethiopia, those didn't get solved. They just got pushed off the front page by other issues, and they all have the potential to escalate, as Gaza did. And there it's going to be increasingly important that alliances that negotiate with each other, US-China would be the main one, have the ability to mute the effects so that Israel and Iran could have the beginnings of a conflict without oil prices spiking and a global recession following. And so that's not something that the US, that's an example of multipolarism. This isn't something the US can control anymore by itself. It has to be done in negotiation with the other great power. Number five, now let me just be number five on my list, which I know Geraldo wants to speak about, is a democratic decline and the rise of the populist authoritarians, and that's going to interact with all kinds of other things. Number 6 and 7 on my list, I am an economist after all. There are challenges to the global economy. The two that I would think about hard in the near term and the medium term are that as the US keeps interest rates high, it plays kind of a game of chicken with the other economies that might not be able to keep pace at interest rates that are up around 6 or 7%. And so as we fight our inflation, which is the responsibility of our Federal Reserve, it might be that our allies can't keep up and that those economies go into recession because of it. The other thing that I think is a medium-term fear, and again, maybe more under a Trump administration than a Biden administration, is that we move into a trade war phase, which would be very, very difficult, which could, especially in middle-income and low-income countries, which have benefited from export-led trade over the past decades. My boss Caroline is here, and maybe you should. I don't want to pretend to be a trade economist in this room. The other thing that I think doesn't get enough attention but should is rising inequality. So we've seen the globalization and the introduction of technologies one after the other. You'll talk about AI this afternoon. Those within economies and between economies, those favor the highly educated over the less educated. They favor the United States over other countries, and they create openings for authoritarian populists who, ironically, tend to think of the highly educated folks as the competition and tend to target them. And so there's a horrible dynamic there because the thing that you do about the globalization and the technologies that favor education is you try to generate educated kids and grandchildren as fast as possible. And that's not something that the authoritarian populists are going to want to do as a matter of policy. So with that, that's my list of 7. Did I answer the question?
You both were in positions, Heraldo's foreign secretary, Roberta as assistant secretary, of looking at the hemisphere as a whole and trying to trigger engagement between countries that are very, very different in terms of outlook, appetite, bandwidth. What is wrong with the inter-American system today? What's happening? If you look at the countries in the region, Heraldo, and Chile probably is one of the few countries, along with Uruguay in Latin America, that I think that has a relative geopolitical moral compass when it comes to global affairs. But if you look at most of the countries in the region, either they've completely jettisoned their interest over foreign policy, my country, or they seem to be much more focused on some of the issues that are impacting democracy, democratic resilience, polarization, economic inequality that was uncorked as a result of the pandemic. Where is the inter-American system today? Roberta, do you want to take a stab on that? Or?
No, I'll leave it.
So I was trying to get Heraldo to answer this question, and as you could see, he wanted me to answer it, which is basically to say neither of us wanted to tackle this one. And I think that's a pretty fair reflection of the inter-American system, the fact that no one actually wants to talk about it right now. Nobody in Washington is particularly talking about it. And from my perspective, when you look at the challenges, whether you use Ellie's 7 terrifying things, right? We all said that Ellie would come on this panel and scare the bleep out of us, and then the rest of us would try and either reassure you or scare you further. But when you look at that list, when you look at engagement with this region, and I focus mostly on North America, the fact is that increasingly, the problems that we confront as a country, as citizens, are multilateral. They cannot be solved unilaterally. They mostly cannot be solved bilaterally, right? Climate, pandemics, terrorism, the largest human migration that we've seen in this region ever. And yet, that is happening at the same time as the system, the multilateral system, which was created precisely to tackle multilateral issues and issues that must be tackled multilaterally. I don't know if it's at its weakest. I'm not a specialist in the multilateral system, and I always defer to Tom Shannon on things of that nature where he's had a greater vision than I do. But I do think we have seen decreasing ability of the inter-American system to tackle those issues. Now, I should say, I don't think it's because the system as such is broken. The system is only as good as governments who participate in it want to make it. And that gets back, I think, to something that was said earlier about an inability of the governments and leaders of this region to come together around sets of principles or agreements to work together to overcome. With the single exception of seemingly the ability to come together to deplore activities by the United States periodically, which it is always easy to get a consensus on other than the United States. And so I think, some of that could be a function of time and leadership at the OAS itself, but it also falls to the leaders of those countries. We have seen multilateral efforts in this region that have been surprisingly and durably successful until recently. Pacific Alliance made enormous sense and was a huge breakthrough in some respects of like-minded countries on open economies and democratic systems. And I think the fact is that at the beginning, what we saw as policymakers, since I was still inside at that point, was that everyone wanted to be part of it. even countries that didn't have free trade agreements with each other or with the United States.
Or weren't on the Pacific.
Or weren't on the Pacific, indeed, or were outside this hemisphere. And I think it was because it was a group of countries who clearly wanted to get something done, were not ideological, were pragmatic, and that was so welcome. That's, I think, dropped off a little bit because of changes in leadership in some of those countries, but I think it is for some of the leaders of these countries, the United States, Canada, which of course, Ellie is a citizen of Canada. Canada is always in favor of multilateralism. It's the way it punches above its weight and should. But others in the region, right, whether it's Brazil or Mexico, can have a huge impact if they move towards acting together in a multilateral framework. And right now, I simply don't see that as something we should expect in the very near term.
Well, first, I agree with Roberta about the importance of multilateral cooperation, something that we've seen declining in recent years. Ellie, you're right about the 7 big challenges, because this opening panel is about facing a challenging new world together. There are some issues out of the 7 that you mentioned that are more important and lasting than others. For example, I think the US-China struggle for, let us say, world hegemony will be with us for the next couple of decades. And that's a lot more important than trade wars or even terrorism that we've had in the past. So there are some issues, there are some crises, there are some challenges that are sort of short-term. There are others that are more lasting or structural. And I think the China challenge to US hegemony, like it has been talked about, the Thucydides trap, when an ascending power challenges a status quo one, status quo being the US and the ascending one being China, creates a great deal of instability. And Graham Allison has studied cases in history out of 16, 12 ended up in wars, like when Athens challenged Sparta, for example, or Germany, the United Kingdom, leading to Second World War. Well, but the issue is that Latin America is affected by all of this, and US-Latin American relations evidently follow a pattern. Latin America it's not a significant actor for the US except at moments of crisis, with the exception of Mexico and perhaps Central America because of trade and because of illegal migration. Under the present Democratic administration in the US, we've had a better mood, better forms, some things that have to be recognized as valuable, like the summit in Los Angeles, or this alliance for prosperity. All of that is very significant, but it's not going to move the needle. It's not going to change the nature of the relationship. And in the more relatively recent past, under the Trump administration, well, Latin America didn't exist. And if it did, it meant problems. It meant fentanyl. It meant bad hombres. It meant all of the negative things that one can think about. And so the region today is not a major player, but it's not only because of the historical trends, it's because of the divisiveness within Latin America. The diversity of views, the ideological struggles, make it so that there are no unifying position to negotiate in a multilateral fora from the perspective of Latin America. You have a Milei government, ultra-liberal conservative in Argentina versus Maduro, wanting to cheat Venezuelans out of an election and not complying with his commitment in Barbados to guarantee a free and fair election. The difference is too huge. And you look at the region, the violation of the Mexican embassy in Quito, in Ecuador, as an expression of those huge differences that exist that led to breaking of bilateral relations, by breaking of relations between Venezuela and Ecuador. There have been threats of breaking diplomatic relations between Argentina and Colombia. Well, the region is not united. What is the appeal of the region of Latin America in this world scenario? Well, it so happens that the region could feed the world. It has green hydrogen. It has sweet water. It has lithium for electromobility. It has copper. It has critical materials. And General Laura Richardson has said it very clearly, you know, we cannot allow China or Russia to have access to these critical materials. What happens is that while the US has been looking elsewhere, China has been making huge inroads in Latin America. Not only trade, right now, most South American countries, the main trade partner is China, but in terms of investments, in terms of loans, through swaps, Argentina, Venezuela, Ecuador, not only that, but China has a satellite tracking base in Argentina, in the Neuquén region, which most experts say that has dual application, not only to, you know, track satellites, but military, run by the Chinese People's Army. And that is what probably led the Argentine President Milei to say that he's going to establish a naval base in Ushuaia, in Tierra del Fuego, at the southernmost tip, together with the United States, possibly as a challenge to China. He said that he's going to inspect the Chinese tracking base in Neuquén, which he cannot do because it is established in the agreement that they signed that Argentina has no right to inspect what goes on in that base. So the region, I guess, is being affected and interacts with these major world situations that are going on. And they are very significant differences. And as Eli mentioned, in the meantime, there's a decline of democracy, which is extremely serious. It's not as in the past with coup d'etats or cuartelazos. No, now it's a kidnapping of democracy from within in a gradual way in countries and governments that are more or less democratically elected begin capturing the other branches of power and they sort of erase the independence of the judiciary or the independence of the legislative branch. And why is this happening? In the past, democracies sort of evolved, the appreciation for democracy with the state of the economy. If there was economic growth, there was support for democracy. If you were in recessive times, that declined. Now it is interacting with violence, with crime. And Latin America is the most crime-ridden region of the world. The largest homicide by 100,000 population is Latin America, even though it is 8% of the world population, it has about 25% of the world homicides. So, and this is affecting democracy, and that's why in El Salvador, You have President Bukele, who says, I will solve this. You have to deliver some freedoms, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. If you're a young person in a población, probably you're going to be in jail as a suspect. Forget about the Constitution. He's going to re-elect himself as many times as he wants to. And if needed, he will take the armed forces of the police to the legislative branch to pass through his legislation. That's why he's got 80% support.
Geraldo, let me try and keep you on China for a bit, because this is one issue that I think, when you look at Washington, D.C. today, and for those of us who live there, there are very, very few issues which elicit bipartisan consensus. And one of them is that the statu quo ante with China is broken. Both Republicans and Democrats coincide regarding the need to recalibrate the geopolitical, economic, trade relationship with China. And because of what you've just described, the Chinese footprint in the region, this is one of those issues which I think is increasingly important in DC. One of the novel issues in the renegotiation of NAFTA to USMCA was this famous sunset clause, which we will hit in October 2025. That's the first revision that we will have of the USMCA. And increasingly, in the last 3-4 months, I've lost count. At least I know that there are two rival bills, one presented by Senator Feingold, a Democrat, one presented by Senator Rubio, a Republican, asking USTR to evaluate the piggybacking of China and Chinese investments, taking advantage of nearshoring flows into Mexico, to make sure that China isn't circumventing tariffs and obstacles that have been put into place, particularly of digital EVs. And this issue will become a very important piece of the revision of USMCA in October, but it's also becoming more and more an issue that is playing as Washington looks at the Americas. This America's Trade Act, which is the first bill in maybe 2 decades, Roberta, that seeks to create a holistic trade, investment, and economic U.S. footprint in the Americas. It's co-sponsored by Senators Cassidy, a Republican of Louisiana, and Senator Bennett of Colorado, in which they're basically asking the U.S. government, the administration, to see how USMCA can be expanded to include countries, for starters, like Costa Rica and Uruguay. So China is becoming maybe one of the issues that galvanizes attention in DC as to the relationship with the Americas, and which will force many countries in the continent, particularly those in South America that have been commodities exporters to China, but also increasingly Mexico, which doesn't have national security mechanisms to investigate whether that Chinese investment passes muster with a North American security paradigm. So how do the countries in the region, and this is for either one of you, how do countries in the Americas triangulate their relations with China, with the United States, take advantage of some of the important investments that are coming in, but at the same time understand that increasingly, regardless of who wins in November in the US, whether it's Trump or Biden, the issue of Chinese investment and Chinese footprints in the region is going to come under scrutiny?
I think there's 2 things I would say. One, you are at a moment now, unlike 10 years ago, 15 years ago, whenever, in which most countries of the region have enough experience with China to know what it means to engage with that country. Whether it's projects like building sports stadiums or deepening harbors or trade type things or gifts, if you will, that come with enormous strings attached, or investment from China in their own industries, commodities, et cetera. And so I think you don't have the naivete you might have had originally on engaging with the Chinese. Remember also, the Chinese are not what they used to be in terms of their engagement and their willingness to convey, funds with extended repayment terms, et cetera. But the second part of this, I think, is that you cannot fight something with nothing. And for too many years, the United States has in essence been saying to the countries of the region, allies and non-allies in some respects, please don't get into bed with China, you know, go with Huawei or LTE for your 5G, or, you know, previous iterations, whether it was fossil fuel programs or other things. Please don't engage that closely with China. It really is not in our interest to do so, but we can't fully tell you why, and we really don't have an alternative for you. The fact of the matter is that without using the language of you must choose sides, the US can actually be, and I think for many countries they wish to be, the preferred partner if there is something on offer. And since USMCA remains, to my knowledge, the highest standard global agreement, it is the template that should be used now to either upgrade those free trade agreements that we already have or to expand the base of those free trade agreements. And if Congress, because the premise of the administration, this administration, I think, has been, we're not going to Congress with a free trade agreement, it would never pass, and we can't do that. And Ecuador basically came to the US, you know, in 2 days in office under Lasso and asked for that when the Biden administration came in. If Congress in a bipartisan way says, we actually want you to do this, and China is the reason, then in my mind, it doesn't matter whether that reason is legitimate or not, or whether Congress wishes to take sides, for countries to take sides, seize that opportunity and begin to, if you will, in some ways, revert to the FTAA vision that we all had many years ago.
Well, I think the issue of the US versus China and the perspective from Latin America has to be viewed from the national interest. And the national interest of Latin American countries, I would say, you know, we would like a better relationship with the US because this is an open society, a democratic society, and that is more in tune with most of Latin American countries, what they aspire to. But the question is national interest. At the moment of the pandemic, the United States did not provide any vaccination for the region. And China arrived with Sinovac and even promised to install factories in Latin America to produce vaccines against COVID. In fact, all the vaccines I have in my body are Chinese, you know, because the Chinese we were able to buy immediately from China in very good terms. The US was totally absent. So what would Latin America want to do in this context? I would say intelligent autonomy, not to ally with the US or with China in this struggle that will go on. Is a very delicate exercise that one has to make because pressures abound. I give another example. When I was foreign minister, we were negotiating the TPP. And when we were about to get to the final moment of negotiation, the Trump administration arrives and withdraws from the TPP. I decided as foreign minister that I would invite all my colleagues, foreign ministers and trade ministers, to Chile to see whether we could rescue it. And I remember reading a lot of editorials in US and European media saying the TPP is dead. So I brought them over to Chile and we began negotiating a TPP without the US. And we succeeded. And the CPTPP was approved, including Mexico, including Peru and Chile from Latin America, and the rest of the countries from the larger Pacific Basin, without the US. And now China has formally requested entry into the CPTPP. So these are opportunities lost, where in the end, Latin American countries have to, safeguard their own their own interest, despite the affinity or the sympathy with the US. And that is something that I think will continue to occur, even though in my view, we have to be very careful about sort of a non-alignment, an intelligent non-alignment with these two great powers. But that's easier said than done, because the pressures that exist on the part of China and the part of the US are very great for relatively small countries. So that would be my reflection on that particular point.
Ellie? You sort of carefully mentioned the word sort of straddling these two giants that are seeking influence in the region. And I was mentioning this report that's coming out tomorrow by RAND on sort of the domestic drivers of potential US retrenchment in the international arena. And it's not absurd that many countries in the region are sitting on the fence because of the elections in November in the United States, because of how tight they will be, waiting to see whether they expend diplomatic capital in their relationship with Washington or not, because why give in, why accept, why do this, why do that, which either Congress or the administration are requesting, if maybe in November there's a change of administration. And you're seeing this in many capitals, not only in Latin America. I think this is a calculus that is occurring in other regions of the world, but certainly when you see certain countries in the hemisphere, for example, weaponizing migration flows to the United States because of the impact that has in the appetite, the bandwidth that the Biden administration has in dealing with certain countries in the region, whether it's do you expend political capital in discussing issues related to critical minerals with the US and China? There will be and there are a lot of fence sitters as we head into the November elections in the United States. Ellie, when you see these types of patterns and you sort of see how countries as different as Hungary or Saudi Arabia or even Israel are playing their games and their calculus as we head into the US presidential election, are there any lessons that countries in the hemisphere should drive from this?
Well, so I started on gloom and doom, and let me just continue on theme. 2 weeks ago, I was in Ottawa, where I was born, formerly the biggest trade partner of the United States, Canada. And one of the big concerns there, again, about a Trump administration, but also somewhat about a Biden administration, is, we have this Canada has this relationship with China, where there's a lot of trade, and there has already been election interference in the relationship with India. There's already been assassination of Canadian nationals on Canadian soil. And so the Canadians say, well, if some of those gray zone weapons were turned on us, we're the best friend of the United States. But if there were more election interference, if there were cyber attacks on our utilities or on our businesses, would the United States actually come to our aid in an administration when we're actually at 1.3% of GDP, way below the 2% line that the Americans like to see? And so I think, in many ways you might think that Latin American countries would like to be Canada, an NBA team and the same language and the long, border that doesn't require defense, and the best friends of the United States. But on the other end, even the best friends are worried about being kind of the kid brother in an alliance, and where if you read the small print carefully, there is no protection. NATO protects Canada against conventional invasion, but that's not what great powers do anymore. Great powers do gray zone stuff, and exactly, and there's no protection written in, and so I think Canada looking to Ottawa to ask what the Canadians are concerned about might be looking 5 years ahead at what Mexico and the rest of Latin America might be concerned about.
Yeah, absolutely, and just to add to that, the issue of disinformation that we're seeing in the United States and countries that can impact Latino voters in the United States, and that's a big issue. You mentioned CPTPP, but when my Canadian colleague and I in Washington were lobbying the US administration, you will remember this, Roberta, Gary Dewar and I, for Mexico and US's, for Mexico and Canada's accession to the TPP. To Ellie's point, I would always joke that Mexico and Canada had one thing in common: we both lived next to an elephant, but it was much better being on top of the elephant than underneath the elephant. But Roberta.
No, just a quick point, because I know we want to take some questions, but you know, we talk a lot just now about walking this fine line vis-a-vis the U.S. and China, or you know, the negatives that I mentioned associated with engagement with China. But I think there's two things we need to remember that we didn't mention, and I hope others will talk about more. There is an incredible opportunity for this hemisphere while the U.S. is having trade and other conflicts with China, tensions with China. And that is really the fundamental impetus behind nearshoring. And let me assure you that the Chinese had a nearshoring strategy way before anybody else did in the hemisphere, ironically. But you have seen for the first time in both the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS and Science Act, the provision of benefits that are North American, not just that old phrase, buy American. Every time it got inserted into a piece of legislation, we would just know that the Canadians would be on the phone to us in 25 seconds. This time, it is North American in its conception and benefits, and that is huge. And what you see from many countries in the hemisphere, even ones that maybe ideologically are not aligned with the US, is how can they get to be part of that queue of countries that can offer to investors and others that the benefit of being part of the IRA or CHIPS Act and the nearshoring phenomenon. So, but that is a window that's going to close, and it's going to close rapidly. So I don't think enough advantage is being taken of that in the hemisphere, and I would actually include Mexico in that, because I'm not sure that the kinds of incentives and laws and regulations in place to make sure you attract that investment are fully present.
Absolutely. Time is tyrannical even in democracy, and I've just been given the 10-minute sign. But Rafa, given that we started late, I'm just going to take a few more minutes so that we can take some questions. Please, when you do raise your hand, please identify yourselves, and questions means that they're followed by a question mark. So please, no statements, questions, and if you're addressing them to one of the panelists, just specify to whom.
Good morning, and congratulations to the panel, excellent panel. And Latin America and the US stand at an inflection point, and in this intricate change of global affairs, in 2024, Latin America and the US must navigate challenges together, as you said, forging a resilient and adaptive future. What are the policy recommendations for the US and Mexico facing a challenging new world together, as this panel talked about, in terms of mitigating risks, enhance resilience, promote diversification and nearshoring, and foster innovation? And thank you.
Roberta, do you want to take that one?
Well, I think to some extent, we've sort of addressed it, at least around the edges. My answer to that, at least as a start, would be a newly invigorated trade relationship that is more hemispheric. A recognition that most of the challenges we face are multilateral, including security, which again cannot really be divorced from the agility that transnational criminal organizations have to cross borders, and that in engaging with this hemisphere, and I would say this needs to be uppermost even though it's rhetorical, that the United States' economic future and prosperity is actually in this hemisphere, whether it's because of the move towards renewable energy, on climate change issues and away from fossil fuels, critical minerals, migration issues, food security. And so instead of being an appendage at global strategy conversations, and in Latin America, in the last 3 lines of a document or a speech, it needs to be the start of that perspective.
Hi there. Teresa Brown with the Bipartisan Policy Center. Geraldo mentioned the national interests of the countries in Latin America, and understanding them is probably key to developing these mutual strategies. But maybe for Roberta and others, how well do you think the United States really understands the national interests of the countries in Latin America? Given what you just said about it being appendage to lots of things, I look at the LA Declaration and I see a lot of commitments, but I haven't seen a lot of actually real actions from the countries, and there's reasons why some countries are acting in their own national interests that are actually maybe contrary to what would be in the United States' interest, and it seems like there is a divergence there. So what do you think, how well do you think they understand it or are trying to?
Well, the only thing I would say is that this room is filled with people who, for most of their career, whether in the United States or outside it, have done their absolute utmost to make sure that the U.S. government, the U.S. citizenry, understands the importance of this region and its national interests, right? Even when those national interests diverge from the U.S. in a non-caricature way. But I don't know that it's, in fact, as deeply ingrained, as well understood throughout our senior policymakers as it should be. I would say that I think the mere fact that a country's national interests on a particular issue may diverge from the United States does not mean that there should not be a conversation that has as its goal closing that gap, if not completely, but lessening it, such that we can work together on the portions of an issue in which we almost certainly do agree.
Geraldo?
Well, there is not a single national interest of Latin America with regard either to the US or to any external actor. They are national interests. But any country in the decision-making, it is going to reason, well, what benefits my own well-being, my own prosperity? So we cannot bet on the US if, you know, the deal with the US is not as good as that offered by other countries. And by the way, there are new actors. India is becoming increasingly a global actor and an actor in Latin America, by the way. So that in the end, even though, as I said, history, and I would say values, make us much closer to the US, aside from geography, and geography matters. In the end, countries will go with what they believe that best serves their own interests and the interests and the well-being of their respective peoples. And that, I think, is part of the problem, because, you know, simply having a mood of cooperation is not enough. I think that part of the challenge that we have as a global community in the present and the future will be either sovereignty or cooperation. Because increasingly, some countries are closing their borders, are betting on nearshoring or ideological shoring, and are not willing to compromise and to give up a little bit of their sovereignty for the sake of living together and cooperate to tackle issues that cannot be tackled unless it is done in a cooperative way, like climate change. And by the way, we're not complying with what we agreed in Paris, and we're going to be 2 degrees Celsius above, and we're seeing the consequences of natural disasters that brings together. Drug trafficking, the cartels that are expanding in the region, but not only in the region. Just read the Le Monde special edition a couple of months ago about the mafias in Europe, and countries not cooperating in Europe, by the way. Instead, the plasticity of cartels that do cooperate. So one of the main challenges is, are we going to go down the road of sovereignty, nationalism, protecting our borders, or are we going towards modalities of cooperation which are, in my view, inevitable?
Let me invoke moderator's privilege to ask a closing question of the three of you. As we look into the tunnel of the November election in the United States, what's the impact and the difference of a Biden 2.0 and a Trump back in the White House for the hemisphere? What's the outlook of policy from Washington regarding one or the other outcome?
I'm very pessimistic because let's put scenarios. If, let us say, President Biden wins re-election, my perception is that Donald Trump won't accept that, and we will have a 2.0 violence, which has been advertised widely, and that may lead to, I don't want to say it, but I read it, abundantly enough, some sort of civil war. So that is it's a very bad scenario in my view. Hopefully, this is just words that won't materialize, but we already know about what happened in January 6th. And if Trump wins, probably he'll do the things that he's saying he's going to do. And that for Latin America will be very bad. For the world will be extremely negative. For NATO will be very, very bad. For Ukraine, probably, for autocrats, it will be a welcome arrival, for Putin, for Orban, for Bukele. So my perspective is pessimistic, but without a doubt, the outcome of the November election will have a huge impact in the region and worldwide, and we're all following polls and following what the U.S. citizens will do at the polls.
Roberta?
There are those who have criticized, as there are critiques under any administration, the Biden administration for a sort of a lack of enthusiasm, a lack of attention to Latin America and the Caribbean, to the Western Hemisphere. And there are certainly more things that can be done and should be done in a second administration. But I will say that I do not think there is any doubt on this. I agree completely with Heraldo. The difference is between positive, even if not always inspired, cooperation in the region with the United States under a Biden 2.0, and frankly, disastrous relationships under a Trump 2.0, which are entirely transactional. And there are countries in this region who prefer that, who prefer an entirely transactional relationship. But I think overall, for cooperation and the exploitation, if you will, of the benefits of this region for all of its citizenry and beyond would be enormous.
So, panelist privilege. let me just break with the pessimism for a moment and try to think beyond the next 4 years. Thank you. I'm also Israeli. I should fess up. So if you look at the National Security Doctrine of the United States, which is a document that I really urge you to take a look at. This is the document that guides the biggest and most powerful bureaucracy in the history of mankind, the Pentagon and all of its friends. What it says is, and this is a document that gets written and revised, the most, and is consistent through both the current administration and the past administration, the Trump administration. What it says is we create alliances with our people, with countries that have shared values, which is to say mostly the liberal democracies, and we work with them to secure a safe world for us and our businesses, etc. And that doctrine is what guides what that bureaucracy does, and that bureaucracy isn't just in charge of trade, it's in charge of all those gray zone things, which is why this message was reassuring to the Canadians a few weeks ago in their nightmares about what they do about cyber attacks and election interference and things like that. And what it says is, share our values, and we will protect you against cyber and transnational crime, and will sanction, using our vast power on financial markets, individuals who are out to get you, and we'll share technology with you, including dual-use technologies. And so to the extent that remains the national security doctrine of the United States, which there'll be a fight over in the next administration, if it's a Trump administration, then one can kind of project forward 5 years and 10 years and say that there is a return in ways that are a little squishy and hard to quantify to sticking with the liberal democracy team.
With that, I hope we've triggered some interesting conversations that will feed into your next panels, and I'd ask you to join me in thanking the panel for their contributions.